It ended up being sold to an ex-cop who was also a professional wrestler. Late last year, in December of 2020, I was looking for another car to fill a garage spot that happened to be vacant and kind of an end-of-year car purchase to be a tax write-off. And so I was talking to different people, and one of those was John Tamarian of Curated down in Miami. Now, of course, John typically deals in the highest-end, perfect examples, low-mile stuff, ultra-collector-grade examples of vintage supercars, mostly Lamborghinis and things like that. But occasionally, he comes across kind of some Ed Bolian examples. He was the source of the Flood Gallardo for the first car trek, and so I said, hey, do you have anything that might fit what you know I would be looking for? He's obviously familiar with my taste in cars. And he says, you know what? I do have the world's cheapest Lamborghini Diablo. And he said it was something he'd been trying to buy for the last several months, but in fact, he had taken on a different project. It was a 1995 Diablo VT that he was kind of going through, putting on some OEM SVR parts, making it kind of an SVR road-going tribute car. Super cool project I think he's about done with. But regardless, he said he didn't mind handing this one off to me. He'd had this guy kind of digging into the history of the car and trying to put the deal together, and he told me that he had agreed to a deal a couple of months prior that they still hadn't been able to consummate of about $92,000 for a 1997 Diablo VT Roadster. Now, of course, that's a screaming deal. I mean, way too cheap to be a great car, but probably exactly the kind of thing that I would be looking for, something that has some weird history, some bad condition, some needs, things like that. I said, that sounds perfect. What is the story? He said, well, just talk to this guy. He'll help you out. He's been kind of putting the pieces together for me, and who knows, maybe you can even get it a little bit cheaper. I get in touch with this guy, and he has kind of put together a timeline of where this car has been. And it has probably the most amazing backstory of any crazy Lamborghini or exotic car, any car really, that I've ever tried to buy. And so as soon as I heard it, I was like, I've got to own this thing. So apparently it was sold new early in 98 as a leftover 1997 red 97 Diablo Roadster. But a few months later, late in 98, it was stolen. And I guess the thieves repainted it to silver, redid the interior in dark brown Alcantara, did all this aftermarket, but very like 90s period correct, carbon fiber, kinesis wheels, rear wheel drive converted, all the things. And they then used a VIN so that they could get away with having this stolen car from an engine fire car out of Hawaii. So a car in Hawaii had burned down, they used the VIN from that car, and they put it on this repainted and redone Diablo Roadster. The car then floats around for about 15 years, using the wrong VINs, obviously a rebuilt title at that point, sells to different leasing companies, different people. It actually ends up in South Florida, and John Tamarian had spent a lot of time actually trying to buy the car, I think around 2009, 2010. And it was always kind of a cheap example, but it looked really, really cool. It had the carbon fiber wing, some carbon fiber vanes on the intakes, all the carbon on the interior. It was just a really, really nicely done car. And at that time, it was in quite good condition, not with that many miles. And so at the time that I was talking about this car, it only had about 8,000 original miles. And so that was very low, but obviously kind of the history had caught up with it at that point. So apparently what happened was around 2013, the car was sold very publicly, I think advertised on Auto Trader, one of the sites that Auto Tempest allows you to search, but it ended up being sold to an ex-cop who was also a professional wrestler up in the Northeast. And so he bought the car, and apparently he had kind of put away some dirty cops who knew that this guy had just bought a Lamborghini, and they got very suspicious, and they actually told the FBI to investigate this guy. And so they start looking into him, and they figure out that this car, that was a very cheap example of a Lamborghini Diablo at the time, but still kind of at a time when Diablos weren't all that appreciated, a time when a really nice 97 Roadster might have been worth $120,000, $130,000. And so I don't know what he bought it for at that point, but it certainly would have been a good bit less. But regardless, with a rebuilt title at that point, people started to investigate the history of this car. And the FBI put the pieces together and figured out that it was this originally red car that had been stolen 15 years earlier. And so they end up seizing the car and starting to figure out, well, what insurance company should rightfully own the car? How can this be figured out? And at that point, the insurance company that would have totaled it years earlier in California had, I guess, lost or misplaced or did not fully have their ownership documentation that you would normally get as an insurance company when you file a car as being stolen. And so a lawsuit or some kind of arbitration begins to happen between this professional wrestler ex-cop, the FBI, the insurance company that originally had the car, and nobody really knows whose it is. And the car goes into the possession of a dealer who is kind of like supervising it, appraises it for the sake of this lawsuit so that everybody can kind of understand how things are set. Now, it appears that the insurance company doesn't fully prove that it's theirs, and it's also unclear at that point if they even care that they get the car back. When insurance companies total it, many times they're reinsured. They're never expecting to get much more than pennies on the dollar back for stolen merchandise, even though it's a Lamborghini at the time, not wildly collectible. And so the insurance company doesn't end up owning the car. In fact, some agreement gets worked out where the VINs that had been inappropriately put on a car have to be stripped, but the professional wrestler gets to keep it. And so he gets to own the car in that circumstance, but honestly, he doesn't drive it all that much. He ends up consigning it for sale with the dealership that had been kind of custodial over the car through the proceeding of the lawsuit. And so that dealer ends up storing it, listing it for sale, but it doesn't really sell. Again, a car like that with a storied past was never going to be a wildly interesting ownership proposition until, honestly, the last few years when all V12 Lamborghinis, especially manual transmission ones, which all Diablos are manual, have gone up a lot in value. So this dealer tries to sell the car, doesn't have any luck, but he has a deal worked out with the professional wrestler where if the car does not sell, he gets to purchase the car at some low amount of money. The car doesn't sell, he ends up owning the car for that. And he drives it very occasionally, kind of as a personal car, on his dealer plate. And around the time that he had started the discussion with John Tamarian from Curated, he had decided that he was going to close down his dealership, kind of retire, and so he didn't really have a good way to continue to enjoy cars like this. He was looking to sell all of his remaining inventory. So at the time that I'm looking at the car's an all-over repaint, a redone interior, a lot of which needs to be redone. The carbon fiber needs to be cleaned up, re-cleared, re-epoxied in some areas. It was just going to need some repairs. It was very due for many, many different services, but it ran. Like, no major error lights on. It sounded good. It drove and things like that, and it was pretty complete. So it was an exciting car to own, and it was going to be very, very cheap. And so I ended up offering $78,000 for this car. And of course, the dealer didn't have a whole lot of options in shopping the car around. And so him being a shrewd negotiator, we decided to meet right smack dab in the middle at 78 grand. And so right around the end of last year, I wired him $78,000. That happened to be the exact same day when Tyler Hoover finalized his deal to buy the 25th anniversary Countach and a silver 97 Diablo Roadster. So even though at that point I'd been working on the deal for many, many weeks, we bought pretty much the same cars on the same day. Now, he said his was the cheapest in the world. He knew that wasn't true because he knew that I was already buying mine. But regardless, I'm happy for him. His is much nicer than mine. So I get the car down here and it drives around. It's a ready to go car. It needs a few things that I start to order, and I start to learn that at this point, anything you need for a Lamborghini Diablo, even a Mercy, any early V12 car from Lamborghini has gotten very, very hard to get. And so I was going to be waiting for a little while, and we started to talk about different things, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to park this thing in the garage. It'll get fixed when it gets fixed. It's a fun project to have around. I also noticed that I really didn't fit very well in it. It had been a while since I had driven a Diablo Roadster, and I learned, all right, I'm going to have to find a new slouch to be able to fit in this thing, but it's hard to get much cooler than a Diablo. I mean, I love everything about a Mercy, and I love the slightly more modern usability, but Diablos are awesome. And so we start doing other things with Car Trek. We start planning Car Trek 4, which involves me needing to buy a cheap Ferrari. And quite honestly, I wasn't all that excited about buying a really terrible 355 or a terrible 360 or a 348 or any of the normal kind of Camry priced Ferraris, which was the theme of the series. And at about that same time, I had closed a sponsorship with Patrick Adair. Last year in 2020, I did a project with him where he took an old broken wheel from one of my Mercies and made a series of rings out of it. He's got an amazing, huge channel about making these custom rings out of exotic materials and things like that. So he made a run of carbon fiber and aluminum rings based on these wheels that he numbered and sold all of them immediately. And so he is a sponsor of the VINwiki channel this year, and he'll be coming on to tell some stories. And so he called me one day and he's like, Ed, I want a project car, but I don't really know what to buy. At the time, he had just bought Stradman's 4GT. He was working a deal to buy Post Malone's 720S. And so he's done very, very well for himself, and he wants to do more in the automotive space. But he's like, is there a car that you could kind of point me to that could be my next project? I really just said, hey, look, if you want to give me kind of a Hoovy style deal where you pay me the inevitable eventual profit now, but then you get a very low cost basis in the car, still plenty of room to spend money, eventually make money, I would be open to that because I needed to create the profit in that car to show it as a trade in order to write down the Ferrari 599 that I was buying for CarTrek 4. And so it seemed like the 599 was a more immediately usable car, certainly something that I needed for the production and something that I thought, quite honestly, I'm probably going to enjoy more miles out of. And Patrick could not have been any more excited to buy the car. He and I had been talking about different rings and different projects that we might do as collaborations throughout the year. And he'll be a sponsor of the VINwiki channel this year. And so it was a perfect deal. So I made 40 grand, as I talked about in the opening of CarTrek 4, and he got a great deal. He'll be able to spend as much as he possibly want to in order to improve the car, make it exactly what he wants. And if he ever does decide to flip it, he'll still have plenty of equity. Of course, the market for V12 Lamborghinis has continued to climb more than any of us can believe, but they're awesome cars. There's nothing like them in terms of presence. And so I'm sure at some point I will own another Diablo, but I certainly bought the cheapest one on the planet at that day, and I haven't seen any cheaper since then, and I don't know that there ever will be, to be quite honest. I think even a total rebuild project that needed accident repairs or anything probably still brings that kind of money. So that was my adventure with the world's cheapest Diablo, and you'll be able to continue following along everything Patrick decides to do with it. He's talking through color schemes. He immediately pulled the engine to do a clutch and some other major servicing. So you can follow along on his channel to see where that goes, and he'll be along soon to tell us even more about it. Shopping for insurance can be an absolute nightmare, but it doesn't have to be thanks to Policy Genius. They're our sponsor for this month at VINwiki, and you can visit them at the link in the description below. You tell them a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your property, and they find the best deal by shopping amongst all the major carriers at the same time. In fact, you can bundle things like homeowners insurance and auto insurance, and the average user that bundles both of those things saves about $1,100 a year. So be sure to check them out and thank them for their support of VINwiki.